Welcome back to Pelangi 21. Today I will show you a West German drama film from 1973 directed by Uli Lommel, titled The Tenderness of Wolves. The story is based on the crimes of German serial killer and cannibal Fritz Haarmann. In war-torn Germany, a string of violent murders of young men and boys plagues a small town. The police find a human skull that is about 18 to 20 years old near the canal. They check missing persons reports, and suspect Fritz Haarmann to be the culprit. Later on, the police raid Fritz's apartment, where they find him in the company of a semi-naked 13-year-old boy. They tell him to get dressed, and they will take him to the police station for questioning. As they are about to leave, Fritz covers something next to the stove with newspaper. The police ask what Fritz is hiding, but he admits that it's just trash. But without anyone knowing, it turns out to be one of the victim's bones. At the police station, the police don't imprison Fritz, who is already a notorious criminal, but the police want him to become an informant, because it will be more useful to them. He is allowed to patrol the train station largely at will, to have performed citizens' arrests upon commuters for offenses such as traveling on forged documents. One night when Fritz is on patrol, he encounters a teenage boy there alone, and without identification. Instead of bringing him to the police, Fritz brings him to his home, promises him money and seduces him. But then he kills and butchers his victim's body. Fritz's neighbor named Frau Linder, who lives in the apartment below him, is suspicious of Fritz, and takes note of odd noises she hears coming from his apartment in the middle of the night. She complains to Fritz about this, but he never responds to her. Another neighbor says to her that Fritz is a nice guy. He works at night to patrol and help the unemployed. Later on, Fritz sells the meat of his victims to Louisa, an aging proprietor of a local restaurant. He says that it's pork from a butcher named Karl. Louisa then invites Fritz, his girlfriend Dora, his secret male lover Hans, and Hans' girlfriend to dinner with the meat that he sold to her. They don't know anything about the meat. During dinner, they all look down on Fritz, saying that if Dora and Fritz get married, then Dora will work while Fritz will be a household man. Even Dora says that Fritz only wants to kiss his little boys. Because among the locals, Fritz has a reputation for exchanging money for sex with teenage boys. The next day, Fritz scolds Hans for last night's dinner, where Hans humiliated him in front of everyone. He says that without him Hans is nothing because he was the one who pulled him off the street. He then asks him to leave his place. Before leaving, Hans says that Fritz is a murderer. But then, Fritz changes his mind, and asks Hans to come back. He still loves him and doesn't want him to leave. Hans says that Fritz loves him very much, and he doesn't know what he will do without him. Then they share a kiss. One night, Fritz is back on patrol at the train station. He is approached by a young man, who comes to him for money in exchange for sex. Fritz agrees to the young man's request, and takes him to his place, and the young man becomes his victim. Meanwhile, Fritz and Hans engaging in petty schemes to make money. They run into Frau Linder on the street, and Hans shows her some disrespect. Later on, they ask people for used clothes on the pretext that they will give them to the needy. But in fact, they will exchange the used clothes for canned food. However, their business is experiencing a setback, and they plan to make money in other ways. When they return home, Frau Linder asks them to apologize for what happened this morning. But Fritz refuses to apologize and tells her not to interfere in their business. One day, a boy comes to Louisa's restaurant to sell meat. Louisa calls Fritz, and Fritz finds out that the meat is stolen, and tells him to leave before he is arrested. Fritz then sees another boy sitting alone. He is about to approach the boy, but he changes his mind and leaves. Later on, he sends the meat to the police chief. A neighbor boy looks for Fritz into his apartment. He rings the wrong doorbell, and Frau Linder opens the door. The boy asks where Fritz is, but Frau Linder tells him to go home, saying that Fritz is not a good man. After Frau Linder comes inside, the boy doesn't listen to her, and goes to Fritz's apartment. That night, Frau Linder hears odd noises again from Fritz's apartment. The next day, Fritz goes to the neighborhood where the children are playing, and gives the boy a hat that belonged to the boy he killed. Later on, Frau Linder witnesses him leaving the apartment in the middle of the night with several bundles of matter wrapped in parchment paper. She follows him as he disposes of the bundles in the river. The next day, Dora comes to help clean up Fritz's apartment. Dora already has a boyfriend, but he always beats her and yells at her. Her boyfriend is always jealous, even though she tells him that Fritz is more interested in boys. Fritz promises that one day he will marry her. The next day, Fritz socializes with Dora and Hans. He then approaches a teenage piano player in a restaurant. He asks the boy to visit him at his place later. Hans and Dora accompany the boy to Fritz's apartment. After the boy goes inside, Hans says that the boy will be trampled tonight, but Dora doesn't know what he means. Inside, Fritz strangles the boy to death before biting his neck, and engaging in necrophilia with the body. Later on, Hans finds Fritz with the boy's corpse. Fritz confesses that Hans is the only one he loves, and Hans asks when he should come back. Dora arrives at Fritz's apartment, and are shocked to see the boy's body lying in Fritz's bed. Fritz assures Dora he is only sleeping, and asks her to leave. When Dora returns, the body has disappeared, because Hans having helped conceal the crime. Later on, Fritz goes to Louise's place, and gives victims belongings. Sometimes he also sells the victims' belongings for money. One day, Fritz and Hans go to a restaurant. There Fritz tells him about his past, but Hans doesn't care about him, and prefers to seduce a girl there. He then decides to go with that girl, and asking for money from Fritz. Later on, Fritz and Hans are back doing a dirty job. This time they are stealing clothes from someone's clothesline. But unfortunately, they can't exchange the clothes for food. One day, a boy comes to Fritz's apartment, while Frau Linder watches him from a distance. She says to a man that many young men came to his place, but she never saw them come out. The man thinks that Fritz is selling young men to Africa. One day, Fritz gets annoyed with Hans, because Hans always used his money to have fun with women, and he doesn't care about him. Meanwhile, the police receive many reports of missing person, but the police can't help much. One night, Fritz follows a boy home, kills him and sells his bike. A man begins to suspect Fritz, after seeing him with the boy last night. The boy didn't return home yesterday, and Fritz admits that he took the boy to the police station. Meanwhile, Frau Linder goes to the police, and confesses that she knows some of the missing persons, after they came to Fritz's apartment. She also says that she saw Fritz throwing something into the river. The police already know that Fritz is a criminal, but they don't want to suspect him right away, and will investigate further. One night, Fritz reports to the police about illegal smuggling at his place. With the help of Fritz, the police arrest the smugglers. The police are grateful that Fritz has been such a good asset to them, but the police question Fritz about a boy's belongings that are in his place. Fritz admits that the boy stayed overnight at his place, before he took him to the police station. At home, Fritz is feeling lonely. He then asks Hans to come back to him. But Hans refuses because he has been working with Dora's boyfriend for money. Hans ends his relationship with Fritz, leaving Fritz bereft. Meanwhile, Fritz continues to kidnap and murder boys and young men. Unbeknownst to him, Hans goes to police with his knowledge of Fritz's crimes. The next day, Fritz confesses to Dora that Hans has been stealing his money all along, even so he can't stay away from him. He then heads off to the country fair with a boy, who later becomes his victim. Later on, he meets the boy's sister, and says that he took his brother to the country fair, and tells her to say hello to her parents from him. Meanwhile, the police stage a raid on Fritz's apartment using a boy as bait. Fritz brings the boy to his apartment. Just as he bites into the boy's neck, the police break into the apartment, alarmed by the boy's screams. Fritz is taken from the apartment in a rage, while people are watching. Inner titles reveal that Fritz was executed for his crimes. This is an excellent film based on the true story of Fritz Harman, who was a serial killer, who preyed on young men and boys. Back in the day, it was very easy for Fritz to pick up his victims, especially in times of poverty and war. He picked up his victims at the train station, and lured them into his apartment, eventually killing them by biting their throats. Their bodies were dismembered and sold as meat. The police didn't suspect him and even used him as an informant, so Fritz easily carried out his crimes. Moreover, He was assisted by his lover Hans. This is a disturbing film and realistic portrayal of this notorious killer. In the film there will be many disturbing scenes, such as nudity, pedophilia, sex and gore. Made in the 70s, this is a good classic, with cinematography, atmosphere, and excellent acting from the main cast. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, and turn on notification.